Good morning and welcome to our morning devotion. And today we continue on our study of that story that leads up to Jesus being born. Today we're going to be in Luke and we're going to talk about how Luke interacted with this story of the gospel. First of all, a couple of interesting things about Luke. Luke was not a Jew. He was actually the only non-Jew that wrote part of the New Testament. And he wrote the majority of the New Testament. Between him and Paul, depending on whether Paul was the one who actually wrote Hebrews, it would be between Luke and Paul that had the most impact, the most writings available for us to learn from, to read in the New Testament. Luke also wrote Acts. Acts is like the continuation of the stories of the gospel. What happened next? And even though Luke was not an eyewitness, I like his account the best. And here's the reason. Because the other ones, Matthew and Mark, had lived through the stories, they wrote from their perspective. Now, what Luke did, Luke was a methodical guy. He loved to dig and he loved to research and he loved to find out all of the information about something. And so this is what he had done. He had done diligent research and he had talked to many different people who had had eyewitnesses of the accounts of Jesus' birth, of Jesus' life, of Jesus' death. He had talked with them. He had talked with Mary. He had talked with Peter. He had talked with all of these people that actually had eyewitness accounts of what had happened. And so when he put it all together, it was like putting together the evidence of, say, a court case. And when he put all the evidence together and wrote out the story, this is the story we get, the story that we read of in Luke. And I feel that it gives us a better understanding sometimes of what had happened because we have a fully rounded picture. Now, the Gospel of Luke, interestingly, was written to be more universal. It wasn't written to the Jewish people. It wasn't written only to the Gentile people, though the way that it was written was more inclusive of Gentile people, and they weren't written as if they were less than. In fact, the way that Luke interacts with all people, Luke is probably one of the most inclusive writers in the Bible because the way that he wrote about women, the way that he wrote about kids, the way that he wrote about the outcasts were ways that were honoring, that were ways that show that Jesus loved them so very much. Luke also talks a lot about prayer. He talks about the Holy Spirit and joy. And more than anyone else, he talks about the good news. He uses it here in Luke, he uses it again in Acts, and he talks about sharing the gospel with others. And this is an important part of Luke's message to us of going and sharing this message that is so important. One of the first things that Luke says is these are the days of Herod. And Herod was just an evil king. He was a bad dude. And he had had a long and terrible reign. He wasn't an Israelite. He wasn't a descendant of Israel or Jacob, but he was actually a descendant of Jacob's brother Esau. And so he came down through a different line. And though he was still Hebrew, he was not an Israelite. Does that make sense? So he was actually from a different tribe completely. And while he was known for building spectacular buildings, and he was also known more so even for his paranoid cruelty. He killed so many people. He even killed people in his own family. So this was not a peaceful, wonderful, everybody's got it together time in history. This was actually a really terrible time in history for something amazing to come. But that's often how God is. So then he shifts the story and he starts talking about Zachariah and Elizabeth and how wonderful they were. They were righteous people. They were obedient, but they were also barren. This is the place where they were the underdog. And so Zachariah is where we begin the story. And Zachariah was a priest. Now, in this time, there were many priests. This was not just a small few priests. These were thousands of priests. And every day, the priests would go into the temple. And in the temple, what they would do is that they would burn incense. And they would make the fire, they would make the daily sacrifices. And in order to choose out of these thousands of priests who would do this every day, lots were chosen. And on this particular day, Zachariah's lot was chosen. And this was a great privilege, especially because the lot that was chosen for him was the most prized lot. It was the third lot. It was the lot that he would burn the incense. He would say the prayers. Now, in incense, incense for Israelite people, when we think of it, we think of the sweet smell. But it was so connected to their prayers. Incense and prayer were something that was very. It was like the embodiment of their prayers being lifted up to God. It was very beautiful to them and a very important part of their worship. Zechariah. So the way that this would have played out is that Zachariah and two other priests would have walked together. The three of them, they would have walked through the outer temple, and they would have sounded a gong. And the gong was actually called a megrapha. And that gong would have sounded. And the gong sounding was a sound to gather to worship. And so the people, the Israelites, the people of God would gather together to worship God at the sound of that gong. They would gather together to sing his praises. And so the three of them would walk into the temple. And when they walked into the temple, they knew their job. The one with the first lot's job was to set the fire, to begin the fire, to bring the coals to set on the fire. And the second person's job was to bring the sacrifice, to kill the sacrifice, to sprinkle the blood. That was his role. And then the two of them left. And the one that was left was Zechariah. And Zechariah knelt before knelt before the altar. The altar was just before the most holy place. And there in that place, on his knees in submission, what he was to do was to offer prayers. And these were not prayers. These were not selfish prayers. These were not prayers for himself. These would have been prayers for his nation. These even would have been prayers for the Messiah to come. Zechariah stayed in there a long time. And the reason is because that is where God met him. He sent Gabriel to come and give Zechariah a very specific message. And we'll talk about that next time. God bless you. Have a wonderful week.